The girl found him on a Tuesday. That was the detail Maren Voss couldn't shake afterward, not the alien, not the six-fingered hand she had pressed against the drainage pipe, not even the sound the creature had made when she'd nearly stepped on it in the dark of the equipment shed. It was the Tuesday, the most ordinary day of the week, the kind of day nothing happens. She was 9 years old, and she had lived on the Voss farm her entire life, which meant she understood the language of things that were out of place. A hinge too rusted to have been recently touched, a boot print in dried mud that faced the wrong direction, the way chickens went quiet before something moved through the grass. The chickens went quiet on Tuesday. Maren had been sent to the equipment shed to find her father's missing wrench. She carried a battery lantern because the shed's overhead light had been burned out since March and her father kept forgetting to replace it, and she moved between the plows and the spare parts and the stacked feed bags the way she always had, without fear, knowing each shadow's name. Then she heard breathing that didn't belong to anything she knew. She didn't scream, she thought about it. The option presented itself clearly, the way options do when your body goes cold and your mind suddenly becomes very precise. She could scream. Her father would come. Then her father's neighbor, Mr. Hallstrom, who was 81 and kept a rifle. Then, eventually, everyone else. Instead, she raised the lantern. The thing in the corner of the shed was large. It was pressed between the old grain drill and the wall with the desperation of something that understood it was cornered. Its long body folded in ways that didn't look comfortable. Its, she counted, six-fingered hands flat against the wood planks. It had a face. She registered that first, the way you always register the face, because her brain was scanning for something familiar to grab onto. The face was wrong in the geometry of it. The eyes were too far apart, and there were too many of them, 4, arranged in a slight arc above where a nose should have been, though what was there instead was a flat ridge of cartilage with slitted openings. The mouth was wider than a human mouth. The skin, if it was skin, was the color of weathered slate, and it seemed to shift texture the way water shifts when the light changes. It was looking at her. She had seen that expression before. Not on this face, not on any face that had ever existed on Earth. But she knew it because she had felt it herself once, when she was 6 and had gotten lost in the North Field at dusk, and the sun was going down fast, and she didn't know which direction home was. That expression was the one a creature made when it was not sure it would survive the next few minutes and had run out of ideas. She lowered the lantern slightly, so the light wasn't directly in its eyes. "Are you hurt?" she asked. It flinched, not at the words she thought. At the sound of her voice, at the fact that she had spoken at all rather than run. She repeated the question more quietly. She wasn't sure why. It seemed like the right register for whatever this was. The creature's mouth moved. What came out wasn't a language, or at least not one she had any frame for. It was a series of resonant clicks and a low harmonic that she felt in her sternum more than she heard with her ears. But tucked inside that sound was something else. A pitch change that went up at the end. The same shape her own question had made. It was asking her the same thing back. She stood in the lantern light for a long moment, looking at the alien in her father's equipment shed, and she thought about the fact that it was Tuesday, and about how long it must have been there, and about how the water trough on the south side of the shed had been drained to half by something she'd assumed was a leak. "Okay," she said, "stay here, don't move." She found her father's wrench. It was on the shelf where it always was, which meant someone else had moved it and returned it without telling anyone. She took it. She turned off the lantern before she left the shed, which was something she had not consciously decided to do, but which felt right, the way you turned off a light when you left a room where someone was trying to sleep. She walked back across the yard. The chickens were still quiet. The night was full of insects doing their ordinary work, and the barn owl that lived in the old silo was hunting somewhere above the north field, and everything was exactly as it was every other September night on the Voss farm, and she had just found something in the equipment shed that had no category in any reference system she owned. She went back to the house. She didn't say anything about what she had seen. She lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the expression on its face. Not the strangeness of the face, the eyes, the geometry, the texture of the skin, but the expression on it. She had cataloged expressions since she was very small because her father's face was often more informative than his words, and she had developed an instinct for emotional data that ran under the surface of things. What she had seen in the corner of the shed was not aggression. It was not calculation. It was not the blankness of something that regarded her as food or threat or irrelevance. It was the expression of something that had been surviving on its own for too long, and had just been found by something it hadn't expected and didn't know how to categorize. She understood that expression. She had seen it in the mirror sometimes, in the months after her mother left, when she was still young enough that the absence had a physical texture to it. At midnight she got up. She made a mason jar of water. She found most of a ham sandwich in the refrigerator, wrapped in the wax paper her father used, and she thought for a moment about whether this was a good idea, whether it might eat something that would make it sick, whether it ate at all. She had no data. She had only the drained water trough and the guess that something which drained a water trough was thirsty and probably, by extension, hungry. She went back to the shed. It was still there. It had not moved much, or if it had moved it had returned to the same corner, the same position. The lantern light found it the same way it had the first time, and it went still with the same quality of controlled stillness, and she set the water and the sandwich on the floor equidistant between them, close enough to be clearly offered, far enough to leave a choice, and backed up. They regarded each other in the lantern light. "I'll come back in the morning," she said, "to check." She went back to bed. She slept better than she'd expected to, which she interpreted as her body telling her that whatever her brain's concerns were, the deeper animal layer of her had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. That night she brought out a mason jar of water and most of a ham sandwich. Her name was Marin. The alien understood names, or at least it understood that the repeated sound she used when referring to herself was how she indicated herself. It had a name too. She tried to reproduce what it showed her, a sound that required clicking your molars together in a particular rhythm and sustaining a low hum simultaneously, and she couldn't do it. So after 3 days she called it Darak and it did not correct her. It was injured. She had guessed that, and it was confirmed over the following days when she managed to get a good look at its left side in better light. Something had gone wrong on its way down. She didn't know what it had come down in or from. She was 9 years old, and her information about spaceships was largely derived from a book she had taken out of the school library 4 times, and its lower left portion had taken an impact. The skin there was different, darker, almost black at the center. When she pressed the back of her hand near it, not touching, just near, she could feel heat. She brought out the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink. She did not bring out the antiseptic, because she had no idea if antiseptic would help or poison or do nothing at all. She brought out clean gauze and the medical tape, and she laid these items on the shed floor in front of Darak the way you'd lay out an offering. He looked at them for a long moment, then he looked at her. She pointed at his injured side. She pointed at the gauze. She made a wrapping motion around her own forearm. He made a sound. Then slowly, he reached out and picked up the gauze roll. He turned it over in his hands 6 fingers. She'd counted correctly, and each one had an additional joint that human fingers didn't have, so the whole hand moved like something architectural when it worked. He pressed the gauze experimentally against his side, hissed a sound that she categorized as pain, and then looked at her again with all 4 of his eyes. "I don't know if it helps," she said. "I'm sorry, it's what I've got." He made the clicking sound. She had started to understand that the clicks weren't random. They had a rhythm that mapped onto something, though she couldn't yet tell what. She sat down on the floor of the shed, and took out the notebook she had brought. "I'm going to figure out how to talk to you," she said. "It might take a while." He looked at the notebook. She could not have said how she knew. It was the same mysterious channel by which you understand tone in any language you don't speak. Some pre-verbal social machinery that evolution had apparently given to more than just humans. But she understood that what he communicated was something like, "You are very small to have decided something so large." "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." Her father was named Dale Voss, and he had come back to this farm from 2 tours in a war that had taken most of his easy conversation and left him a man who communicated mostly through tasks. There were chores to be done, and he did them. There was food to be grown, and he grew it. He had a daughter who was the most complicated thing in his world, and he loved her without being sure he was good at it. He noticed things, though. He had learned to notice things in a different country under conditions where not noticing got you killed, and that attention had never fully switched off. He noticed that Marin was spending more time in the equipment shed. He noticed that the water trough on the south side had begun refilling itself by unknown means. He noticed that 2 of the larger mason jars were missing from the kitchen shelf and had not been returned. He waited. He trusted his daughter and he trusted his instincts, and neither of them was telling him she was in danger, but something was in that shed. On Thursday of the 2nd week, he walked out at dusk with a lantern of his own and opened the shed door. He had not expected the size of it. He stopped. He kept the lantern steady. The creature in the back of his shed had gone very still, and Dale Voss understood stillness as a language too. He had spent months in environments where the stillness of a hillside was either peace or ambush, and this stillness had a particular quality to it. Controlled, deliberate. It was making itself as unthreatening as something that large could make itself. Beside the alien was a notebook, open, with words in his daughter's handwriting and symbols he didn't recognize arranged in a grid. "She's been teaching you," Dale said. "It wasn't a question." The alien made a sound, a low sequence of tones and then something that was clearly structured, 2 sounds repeated with an inflection at the end. "Yes." Dale Voss stood in the door of his equipment shed for a long moment. The war had taught him a lot of things, and one of the most persistent was that he was capable of greater adaptability than he would have believed beforehand. A man didn't know what he'd do until the situation arrived. He had believed he would break, and he hadn't. He had believed he would freeze, and he hadn't. He lowered the lantern and sat down on the overturned bucket by the door. "You're hurt," he said. The alien looked at him. All 4 eyes, and in them Dale Voss saw something that he recognized as clearly as he recognized his own face in a mirror, because he had seen it in his own face in a mirror. The expression of someone trying to hold themselves together in circumstances that had made holding together very difficult. "I'll get the real first aid kit," Dale said. "The one from the truck, not the one she took from under the sink." It was harder than Marin had expected to teach language to something that didn't share any of her acoustic range, any of her visual reference points, any of her cultural substrate. She had thought it would be like learning French in school, difficult but structured, with a clear path from where she was to where she wanted to be. It was nothing like that. It was like trying to build a bridge across a canyon by throwing rope at the other side and hoping something caught. But things caught. The notebook grew. She drew pictures. She was not a good artist, but she had a clear instinct for which pictures communicated the thing she meant. And Derek would study them with the focused patience of something that understood that communication was worth any amount of time. He had 3 notebooks by the 3rd week, and he had begun initiating communication himself, choosing images from the pages and pointing, modifying them with sounds until she could hear what he was building. She learned that he had a place he came from. She could not understand the details. She had not yet built the vocabulary for distances on that scale, but she understood that it was far and that he could not go back the way he had come. She learned that he had not intended to land on this farm. He had intended to land somewhere much emptier and wait for a signal. The signal had not come. She learned more slowly, through many misunderstandings and restarts, that he had somewhere else to be, something he needed to get back to. She learned this because he showed her an image he carried. Not in a notebook, it was on a small device she had never touched, a rectangle of dark material that emitted a soft light when he pressed his palm to it. The image showed two figures. They were of his kind, but smaller. Young, she understood. Children, she understood that too. Two children of his kind, and they were somewhere he was not. She looked at the image for a long time, then she looked at him. "They're yours," she said. The clicking sound, the familiar rhythm, yes. Dale Voss's wife had left when Maren was 3. It was not a dramatic story. There was no villain, no catastrophic event, only two people who had been too young and too damaged in different directions, and who had finally, gently, run out of road. She had moved to a city 3 states away. She called on birthdays and sometimes other days. Maren knew the situation and had incorporated it with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children apply to the circumstances they're born into. Dale had not incorporated it as cleanly. He had understood it. He had agreed that it was the right choice, that forcing something broken to keep functioning only made the break worse. He had believed everything he told himself about it. But there were nights, not often, not in ways he'd have described to anyone, when he sat on the porch after Maren was asleep and thought about what it meant to be in the right place, doing the right thing, and still feeling the specific gravity of an absence. He found Derek easier to talk to than he'd expected. He could not have explained this. They had, at best, 70 or 80 words in common, plus Maren's notebook system of images and indicators. Most of what they exchanged was gesture and tone, and the shorthand of two entities that were better at listening than at speaking. But Dale had spent years in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language, and he had learned what he always learned in those conditions. That language was a tool for specificity, but that understanding happened at a different level. There was a particular quality that the porch evenings had. Dale had never been a man who needed to fill silence. The war had cured him of that if it had needed curing, and the years on the farm afterward had confirmed it. He could sit in the dark with a cup of coffee and let the night do what it did, and this was not loneliness. It was simply how he was made. He had expected company to disrupt this, and it hadn't. Derek had a similar relationship to silence, which made sense when Dale thought about it. A creature that communicated through layered frequencies probably understood more about what was carried in the absence of sound than most humans ever would. They had conversations of a kind. Uneven, gestural, cobbled together from Maren's notebook vocabulary and Dale's hard-won experience reading the unsaid. Derek would pick up a page and indicate something, and Dale would respond, and they would work their way around a subject the way you worked around a country on foot, slowly, by feel, finding the paths that were actually passable. Dale asked about the children. He asked carefully, not pressing, the way you asked about things that you sensed were tender. He had seen the image on the device. He had watched Derek look at it sometimes in the shed when he thought no one was watching. The careful, contained way of someone who allowed themselves something only when they were certain no one would see the allowing. He understood that containing. He did it himself with his daughter when he was trying to be strong enough to be reliable. The problem was that it had a cost, the containing. You could do it for years and think you were fine, and then something happened. A Tuesday in September. A daughter who came home and said nothing but whose eyes said everything. And the thing you'd been containing shifted, and you felt the edges of it. Derek had been away from his children for long enough that the containing had become structural. It wasn't a choice anymore, it was a load-bearing wall. He understood that Derek was in pain. Not just the physical injury, which was healing slowly. in ways that involved processes Dale couldn't follow and didn't try to interfere with, but the other kind. The kind that didn't show on the body. He understood that Derek had made a choice to come here, to this galaxy, to this solar system, to this particular corner of one unimportant planet, and that the choice had come at a cost he was still calculating. He understood, over 3 weeks of porch evenings with 2 cups of coffee and one improbable creature sitting on the steps, that Derek was a father first and an explorer or an ambassador or whatever he was second, and that the two things had gotten tangled in a way that might not untangle. "I know something about that," Dale said one evening. Derek looked at him, the 4 eyes in the failing light, the expression that had no name in any human language but that Dale Voss had been wearing for 6 years. "Not the same," Dale said. "I'm here and she's here." "That's more than you've got right now." He poured the second cup. "Let's figure out how to get you back." Marin did not know about the porch evenings at first. She knew about them by the 3rd time she came downstairs for water at midnight and found the back door unlocked and her father's boots on the mat. She did not say anything. Her father did not say anything. They maintained a cooperative silence the way they maintained most things in their house, by mutual understanding that some territories were private and that this was a form of respect rather than distance. But she noticed that her father had driven into town 2 Saturdays in a row and come back with things she didn't recognize. Equipment, some of it, and books, several of them, on subjects she had to get close to read. Astrophysics, radio wave propagation, something with a title she could barely parse about signal encoding in low-frequency transmission. She was 9. She understood more than she was supposed to. She went to the shed on a Wednesday afternoon and found Derek sitting with the notebook open to a page she hadn't drawn. Her father had added pages, she could tell by the handwriting, more compact than hers, slanting left. The images were more technical than her own, diagrams of something circular, lines with numbers she didn't understand. "He's trying to help you send a signal," she said. Derek made the clicking sound. "Yes." "To who?" He took the notebook and found a page, opened it, pointed. 2 figures, the image he carried on his device, his children. "Are they close?" she asked. He pointed to a diagram her father had drawn. She studied it. She was not a physicist and she was 9 years old, but she had spent enough time with her father's work over the years to understand a rough schematic. The diagram showed something being sent from a point in the center outward, in a wide arc, toward a cluster of points at the edge. She thought about distance, about what was on the other side of the sky. "That's going to take a lot of power," she said. He pointed at another page. She leaned in. Her father had written in his compressed handwriting, "Antenna array, multiple points elevated synchronized." Below that in a different pen, maybe later, Hallstrom's Ridge, 300 FT elevation, worth asking. She looked at the page for a moment. "He's going to ask Mr. Hallstrom," she said. The clicking sound. "Does Mr. Hallstrom know?" she asked. A longer pause. A sound she hadn't categorized yet, lower than the clicks, a sustained note with a quality she was beginning to associate with the complicated space between yes and no. Dad told him, she realized. Eugene Hallstrom was 81 years old and had survived 2 wars, a failed farm, 3 winters that the county extension office had categorized as unsurvivable, the death of a wife, the death of a son, and what he described, when the mood took him, as the slow defeat of being outlasted by everything you'd once been certain was temporary. He had a ridge. It ran along the northern edge of his property, 300 feet of elevation, clear sight lines in every direction, and a cluster of old radio equipment in a barn that he'd kept not out of nostalgia, but out of a conviction that a man who threw away good equipment was a fool. Dale Voss came to him on a Thursday with a bottle of decent whiskey, and what Hallstrom later described as the most unusual request he had received in 81 years, which was saying something. Hallstrom listened. He did not interrupt. He looked at the diagrams Dale had brought. He looked at the photographs Dale had taken of the shed interior, carefully framed to show the equipment and the notebooks and the healed injury without revealing too much of Darak's face. When Dale was done, Hallstrom poured 2 glasses of the whiskey and sat quietly for a moment. "Is it dangerous?" he asked. "No," Dale said. "I don't think so. I don't read it that way." "Your daughter like it. She named it." Hallstrom considered this. "A 9-year-old named it, and your instincts say it's safe." "Yes." Hallstrom drank his whiskey. "Well," he said, "I'll tell you something. I've been up on that ridge 1,000 times. Beautiful view. Never saw anything up there worth a damn except sky." He set down the glass. "Might be time to put something up there that does something." The building of the antenna took 11 days. This was longer than Dale had hoped and shorter than Hallstrom had predicted. They argued about the architecture of it in the specific and productive way of 2 people who disagreed about methods but agreed on outcomes, which Dale had found over his life to be the most useful kind of argument. Hallstrom had a working knowledge of radio transmission that predated the equipment he owned. He'd learned on equipment older than that equipment. And Dale had a systematic patience and a willingness to read anything, which meant that between them, they had 2 overlapping bodies of knowledge with a large gap in the middle that they were filling with improvisation and stubbornness. Darak watched their arguments from the corner of the shed, where he had taken to sitting when they worked. He watched with the focused attention of something that was not just observing but studying, and Dale noticed this, and after the 3rd evening started explaining what they were discussing, in fragments and gestures, because it seemed possible that the creature could contribute something if it understood what they were trying to do. This turned out to be correct. On the 5th day, Darak picked up the notebook and drew something. Dale looked at it. He showed it to Hallstrom. Hallstrom put on his reading glasses and studied it for a long time. "That's a phased array," Hallstrom said. "I know what it is," Dale said. "Can we build it with what we have?" Another long look. "We'd need copper wire, a lot of it." "I know where there's copper wire," Dale said. He'd been looking at the wiring in the old grain elevator for 2 weeks, trying to decide whether it was salvageable. It was. Marin was not permitted to help with the technical components. Her father was firm on this, and she understood that the firmness came from care rather than dismissal, but she helped with everything else. She carried equipment from Hallstrom's barn to the ridge. She brought water and sandwiches. She held the flashlight at 10 p.m. when the 2 men were trying to align something by eye and couldn't see what they were doing. She drove the truck down to the grain elevator and helped load copper wire until her arms ached. She also, in that time, kept working on the notebooks. She wanted to understand more about where Darak came from. Not the location, which was beyond her frame of reference, but the shape of it, what it was like to be there, whether it had seasons, what they ate, what children there learned first. She asked him, through the notebooks and the accumulated signs they had built, "What do your children call you?" He was quiet for a moment, the stillness he had when a question landed somewhere significant. Then he made a sound she hadn't heard before, soft, 2 syllables with the lower harmonic underneath, a name she understood, what they called him. She tried to repeat it. He corrected her. She tried again. He corrected her again, but this time the correction had something in it she recognized as gentle, the way her father corrected her when she was learning something and the patience was real. She tried a 3rd time. The clicking sound, not quite yes but close enough. She wrote the sound phonetically in her best approximation. She looked at it for a moment. "It sounds a little like Papa," she said. "In some languages that's what kids say." He tilted his head. 4 eyes. The gesture she had come to understand as genuine curiosity. "It means father," she said. "In some languages, not mine. Ours is different, but some." He looked at the word she had written, Papa. He looked at it for a long time. Then he made the sound again, his name, the two soft syllables, and she heard it differently this time. Heard the shape of it. Heard how the frequencies aligned. "Does it mean something?" she asked. "Your name, does it have a meaning?" He took the notebook. He thought for a long time, which was what he did when he was working out something that required careful translation. He drew a picture. It took him several attempts to get it right, and he showed her the earlier attempts, crossed out, which she'd come to understand meant, "This was close but wrong, this one is closer." The final image was a structure, something that stood with its roots in the ground and its arms wide open. Not a tree exactly, but shaped like a tree, shaped like something that stayed. She looked at the image for a long time. "That's your name," she said. The clicking sound. "It means something like the one who stays," she said, testing. He looked at her and made the sound again, and she heard in it something more than she could decode, something that told her she was close, but that the full meaning was bigger than her translation. "The one who stays," she repeated quietly. The night the antenna array went live was a clear night in October. Maren stood with her father and Mr. Hallstrom on the ridge and looked up at the sky, which was enormous in the way the sky only was when you were above the tree line and far from any lights. Derek stood with them. It was the first time he had been outside the shed in the week since she'd found him, and Maren watched him carefully for the first few minutes, the way you watched someone you cared about returning to something that had hurt them. But he didn't look afraid of the sky. He looked at it the way you looked at something you had missed. The equipment was ugly and improvised and jury-rigged from things that weren't designed to work together, and Dale Voss and Eugene Hallstrom had stayed up past midnight more than once arguing about components in the specific way of two men who cared deeply about getting something right and disagreed about how to do it. But it worked. Dale had checked and rechecked and checked again. Derek crouched in front of the transmitter. Crouched was approximate. His leg structure didn't quite allow what that word implied, but the intent was crouching, and laid his hands on it. The device from his pocket, the one with the image of his children, connected to the system through a coupling Dale had improvised from copper wire, and a component Hallstrom remembered having from a 1970s CB radio setup. He worked for a long time. The transmitter hummed. Maren stood next to her father and looked at the sky and didn't say anything, because nothing she could have said would have been useful, and she understood that this was one of those times when the most helpful thing she could do was be present and quiet. Her father put his hand on her shoulder. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "You started it, you found him, and you didn't run." She thought about the equipment shed in the lantern light, the face she hadn't had a word for, the breathing that didn't belong to anything she knew. "He looked scared," she said. "When I found him, he looked like me when I got lost in the North Field that time." Her father's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. He remembered that evening. The 7 minutes between realizing she wasn't where she was supposed to be and finding her walking up the far fence line, 6 years old, arms swinging, completely unaware she had scared him badly. "You weren't scared," he said. "I was," she said, "for a second, but then it was more interesting than scary." He laughed, quietly the way he laughed, like a door opening slightly. Derek looked up from the transmitter. He made a sound, a sustained, harmonic tone with the clicking underneath, and it went on for longer than his usual communications, building in a way that felt deliberate. He was looking at Maren when he made it. She didn't have words for all of it. She had learned enough to get the shape, but she felt it more than she decoded it, felt it the way she felt the meaning of music sometimes, not in the words but in the movement of the sound. She thought it meant something like, "You are the first one who looked at me without calculating what I was." Or maybe, "You brought me water and a sandwich, and that was the beginning of everything." Or maybe there was no translation that kept what it was, and you just had to accept the feeling. She felt it in her sternum, the same place she'd first felt his voice in the dark. "You're welcome," she said. The response came 3 nights later. It came as a burst of structured signal that the equipment logged, but that none of them could interpret except Derek, and he sat in front of the printout. They had rigged a printer, another jury-rigged improvisation, because Dale Voss believed in having a record of things for almost an hour without moving. Maren sat across from him. Her father had made tea and left it near her, the way he left things near people when he wanted to be useful without intruding. When Derek looked up, his expression was different. She had been studying his expressions for weeks, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything, and she had not seen this one before. It was not the fear from the first night, and it was not the pain from the injured side, and it was not the careful patience he brought to the notebooks. She thought it might be relief. She had seen relief on her father's face once or twice, in the moments when a thing he had been braced against turned out to not be as bad as he'd expected, and the bracing could finally stop. It looked like that, like a load being set down. He took the notebook. He opened it to a blank page. He drew 2 figures, the children, from his device, and then he drew a line from them across the page to a point on the far edge, and he circled that point. He looked at her. "They know where you are," she said. The clicking sound. "They're coming for you." A longer answer, more complex, she caught fragments of it. "Not coming here. A meeting point, somewhere else, not long." "How long?" she asked. He thought. He drew a circle on the page. Then he pointed at it and looked at the sky and pointed again, and she understood. He meant the moon. How many times the moon completed its arc. 1 month, she guessed. He adjusted her gesture. Less. 3 weeks. The sound she had come to understand as close enough. She looked at the page. The 2 small figures, the line, the circled point. "Are they okay?" she asked. "Your kids?" He was still for a moment, the weight of the question visible in his posture, in the way the long body settled. Then he made a sound, the 2-syllable one, the one that mapped to yes, and there was something else underneath it, something that vibrated at a frequency she couldn't quite decode. She thought it might be, "I don't know yet, but I am going to be very close to them very soon, and then I will know." "Good," she said. 3 weeks had a shape to them, when you knew they were the last 3 weeks. Maren went to school and came home and did her chores and ate dinner with her father, and she sat in the equipment shed in the evenings and worked on the notebooks, and she understood that she was trying to get as much into the notebooks as she could because, after 3 weeks, the notebooks would be here and Derek would not. She didn't say this out loud. She wasn't sure she had to. Her father started teaching her about the equipment on the ridge. She was young for it, but he explained things in the way he had always explained things, without talking down, without simplifying beyond usefulness, trusting her to get more than she was supposed to be able to get at 9 years old. He showed her how the array worked. He showed her the frequencies Derek had used. He explained, in terms she could mostly follow, what made this particular signal architecture functional, and what would make a different one fail. She asked why. "Because someone should understand it," he said. "Mr. Hallstrom." "Hallstrom's 81, Dale said, not harsh, just true." She looked at the equipment. She thought about the signals going out across distances she couldn't comprehend, finding something in the dark, getting an answer. She thought about the antenna on a hill, jury-rigged from pieces that weren't meant to work together, and how it had worked anyway. "Will they come back?" she asked. "Not him, other ones, will there be others?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "Probably," he said, "someday." "Will we be ready?" He looked at her, the fall light on his face, and the expression that appeared there sometimes when she said something that hit a different layer than she'd aimed for. "You were ready on a Tuesday in September," he said, "with a lantern and a ham sandwich." On the last night, Derek came out of the shed on his own. Maren and her father were sitting on the porch. They had both started sitting on the porch more. this habit they'd picked up, which Marin understood was part of what Derek had brought into the house with him without either of them saying so. And he came around the corner of the shed and walked to the porch with the deliberate care of someone who has practiced a route and wants to get it right. He sat down on the porch steps, the same place he sat in the evenings her father had described to her in fragments, the two of them with coffee in the dark. He had a notebook, one of the ones she had filled, carried under his arm in a way that was clearly intentional. "You're taking it with you," she said. The clicking sound. "I made another one," she said, "for us. I copied everything into it." He made a sound she hadn't heard. She tilted her head, trying to find the shape of it. He made it again, and she realized it had two different components. The lower harmonic she associated with something significant, and the clicking rhythm she associated with a statement rather than a question. And woven between them was a phrase she recognized, two sounds in sequence. One she associated with the image of a bridge, one she associated with the image of 2 points. Between connection, something that crosses. Like something that keeps two places connected, she asked. He looked at her, 4 eyes in the porch light. He touched the notebook. He touched the device with the image of his children. He looked at the sky. She understood. The notebook was a bridge, a translation of a world he'd been stranded in. Evidence that stranding wasn't always tragedy. That a child with a lantern could choose, in a crucial moment, curiosity over fear, and that this choice could become the beginning of something that neither side had expected. He was going to show it to his children. Her throat was doing something she found inconvenient. She was 9 years old and she didn't cry much, and she was not going to cry now, but the inconvenience was real. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them about the farm. Tell them about the chickens going quiet. Tell them that there's a kid here who would like to know what it's like where they are, and that if they ever figure out how to write back, she'll be on the ridge." Her father, sitting in the chair behind her, said nothing. She could hear him breathing. Derek looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound, the 2 syllables she'd been trying to pronounce for weeks, his name, his children's name for him, and this time she caught it correctly. She heard both frequencies simultaneously, the resonance, the harmonic beneath. She said it back. His expression did the thing that she had no word for. The thing she had first seen in the corner of the equipment shed, and had spent weeks trying to understand and still couldn't fully translate, except that she knew it was significant and she knew it was about her. "I'll practice," she said. On his last full day, she asked him the question she had been building up to for weeks. She had been building up to it because she wasn't sure she had the vocabulary, and she wasn't sure she had the right. It was one of those questions that sat on the border between languages, where even in her own language she would have had to choose words carefully. She asked, "When you get back to them, what will you tell them happened here?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought maybe she hadn't communicated it clearly and was about to try again, with a different arrangement of images. Then he picked up the notebook. He drew slowly. She watched his 6-fingered hands move, the extra joints finding angles that human hands wouldn't, and she thought that she would remember the way he drew for the rest of her life. The specificity of it, the deliberateness, the way he always tried 2 or 3 approaches before settling on the one that was truest. He drew the farm. She recognized it from above. She had only seen it from above once, from the water tower her father had climbed to fix something when she was 7 and had taken her up with him. The equipment shed, the north field, the porch. He drew the ridge with the antenna. He drew a small figure with a lantern. He pointed at the figure, he pointed at her. He made the sound that meant, "Yes, this is you, not an approximation, you." Then he drew something else, below the farm and the ridge, filling in below them, not the ground, but something else. Something that spread out from the farm in all directions. She tilted her head. He pointed at the spreading thing. He made a sound she'd heard him use twice before, both times in contexts where she'd associated it with something like consequence or result, an effect that extended beyond the original cause. Then he pointed at her again, and at the lantern, and at the figure of himself small in the corner of the equipment shed. "You're going to tell them that something started here," she said. He made a sound. Longer, more complex. She caught what she could. Something was possible here. Something was chosen here. Something will grow from here that does not have a name yet. She didn't know if she was translating accurately. She thought she might be translating her own understanding of the situation more than his precise words, which was always the risk with an imperfect bridge. But she looked at the image, the farm spread out below the ridge, and whatever he had drawn spreading outward from it, and she thought that even if she was wrong about the details, she was probably right about the shape. "Okay," she said. He left before dawn. She had expected him to disappear while they slept, and when she woke up early and came downstairs and found her father already awake, already dressed, she understood that her father had expected the same thing and had wanted to be there. They drove out to the ridge together. Derek was already there, standing in the dark near the antenna array, doing something with his device that sent pulses of structured light into the sky at intervals. Calling in coordinates, she thought. Something like that. When she got out of the truck, he turned. They stood in the pre-dawn dark on the ridge that belonged to an 81-year-old man who had come out here with them, who was standing near the truck wrapped in a coat, who had said when they'd picked him up that he was too old to sleep through interesting things and wasn't going to start. The sky was doing what the sky does before sunrise. It was not light, but it was less dark, and the stars were fading at the edges, and there was a color at the horizon that didn't have a name but that she had always thought was the sky practicing being something else. Derek held up the notebook. She held up the copy she'd made. He made a sound, long, complex, all the frequencies at once. She couldn't catch all of it, but she caught the piece that mattered, the piece she had learned in the first week and that had been in every conversation since, that he used to confirm, to acknowledge, to indicate that understanding had occurred. The clicking rhythm that meant yes, and beneath it the low harmonic that meant something had passed between them that both of them held. She had heard it as yes so many times that it had started to feel like its full meaning, but standing on the ridge in the pre-dawn dark she understood that it was bigger than yes. It was, "I have received what you sent. I am carrying it. It will arrive somewhere it has never been." The light in the sky shifted. Something in the array hummed and went quiet. He was gone. She stood where she was for a moment, looking at the sky. Her father came and stood beside her. He didn't put his arm around her, because he understood that she wanted to stand in this the way you stood in weather, fully, without shelter. After a while she said, "Do you think they got to him okay, his kids?" "I think so," Dale said. "You don't know?" "No," he said. "I don't know. I think so, though." She looked at the sky. The stars were almost gone now, the light filling in around them like water filling a bowl. "He wrote something in one of the notebooks," she said. "The first one, the page I hadn't seen until a couple days ago. I think he added it sometime in the middle, I don't know which night." "What does it say?" She had the notebook in her hands. She opened it to the page, though she had memorized it. The image was simple, clearer than his early drawings, the kind of clarity that came from having developed a shared visual language. Two figures, one large, the alien shape of him, and one small, human, standing on a ridge. Below the image, two symbols she had decoded, the one meaning the one who stays and the one meaning this place. The one who stays, this place. She had turned it over and over in her head for 2 days. "I think he means me," she said. "Or the farm, or, I don't know, maybe both. The one who stayed here when they should have run." Her father looked at the page for a long time. "Or," he said, "he means that the staying is the point, that you didn't have to stay. That the choice was the thing." She thought about that. The sun came up over the edge of the world and turned the sky a color that still didn't have a name. The antenna array stood on the ridge in the light, jury-rigged and functional and proof that things not designed to work together sometimes did. Eugene Hallstrom cleared his throat from near the truck. "I don't know about you two," he said, "but I'm 81 years old and I didn't have breakfast, and I think extraordinary circumstances call for something better than cereal." Marin laughed. She felt the laugh come up from somewhere below her sternum, the same place she'd felt Derek's voice on the first night, and she let it out. "Hallstrom makes good eggs," she told her father. "Best in the county," Hallstrom said. "Only humble person I know." They drove down from the ridge in the morning light with the notebooks in her lap and the sky empty and wide and full of everything she didn't know yet, which was, she was beginning to understand, not the same thing as empty at all. The winter was long. Not harder than winters usually were. The farm had its rhythms. The animals needed what they always needed. The fields rested under their cover of frost. The equipment sat quiet, but longer, in the way that all time became long when you were waiting for something and didn't know if it was coming. She thought about the notebooks a lot. She had her copy, and she worked through it the way she worked through school books she wanted to understand completely, not reading for content but reading for structure, trying to find the underlying system. There was a system. She knew there was a system because there was a system in everything, and she had built most of this one herself, and she knew where the gaps were. The places where she had improvised a gesture and it had held, but the foundation under it was thin. She worked at those places. She extended the vocabulary as far as it could go with no one to practice it with, which felt like trying to throw a ball against a wall that might not be there. She thought about his children. She thought about them the way she thought about things that existed beyond her knowledge, not with the frustration of not knowing, but with the curiosity of a problem that hadn't been solved yet. They existed. They were somewhere. They had received their father back, she hoped, and he had shown them the notebooks, she imagined, and somewhere on the other side of distances she couldn't map, two small aliens were looking at a human girl's handwriting and her imperfect drawings and trying to understand what they were seeing. She thought about what they might make of the word Papa. She thought about the fact that no matter what happened next, no matter whether the signal ever came or not, no matter whether the Ridgeline array ever registered anything again, she had been the first. The first human. The first one who'd found something impossible and chosen curiosity over fear and stayed. She was 9 years old and then 10, and she sat with that responsibility the way you sat with heavy things, not trying to lift it all at once, just getting used to the weight. The next spring, there was a signal. It came in at 2 in the morning, and the alarm her father had rigged on the array woke them both, and they drove out to the ridge in coats over pajamas and found the equipment registering an incoming transmission. It was a narrow band, tightly structured, nothing like the ambient signals that occasionally set off the alarm and turned out to be satellite drift or atmospheric scatter. This was deliberate. She felt that as soon as she looked at the readout, the same way she'd felt the deliberateness of Derek's breathing in the shed, the quality of intention, the difference between noise and signal. It took most of the morning to decode. Her father worked on it with the concentrated focus she recognized from the equipment builds, the same stillness, the same willingness to restart when he'd gone wrong. Hallstrom came over at 7 with coffee and helped. Marin sat with the notebook on her knees and worked on her end of it, the part that was in a language she knew, however imperfectly. When they finally got it resolved into something that was interpretable, Marin read it 3 times. It was not in her language and not in her father's and not in Hallstrom's. It was in the visual language of the notebooks, the system she had built with Derek over 6 weeks in an equipment shed, and it had been drawn by someone smaller. The lines were less steady. The style was different, younger. It showed 2 figures, alien, both of them small. Below them, 2 words in her phonetic notation that could only have been shared from one notebook to another. across whatever distance separated here from where they were. The first word, hello. The second word, the one she'd written phonetically in her best approximation, the one she'd tried to teach him to understand about himself. Papa. She sat on the ridge in the spring morning with the notebook on her knees and the signal decoded, and her father and Mr. Hallstrom standing beside her, and she read the word 3 times, and then she looked up at the sky. They got him back, she said. Nobody argued. She took the notebook and turned to a blank page. She took the pen from her pocket, the one she kept specifically for the notebooks. She thought for a moment about what to say first, about where to begin, about what a 9-year-old girl had to offer 2 children on the other side of the sky who had just learned that someone here was listening. She thought about a Tuesday in September, about a lantern in the dark, about the choice between screaming and staying and what had happened because she'd stayed. She thought about Derek in the corner of the shed, folded into the shadow, injured and patient and out of options. She thought about the water trough going down by half, and the wax paper from her father's sandwiches that she'd found pressed flat under a rock behind the shed 2 days after that first night, which meant he'd kept it. She didn't know why he'd kept it. She had a theory, though, which was that on a very long journey through very empty space, a piece of wax paper was proof that somewhere, something had offered. She thought about her father on the porch in the dark, and about Hallstrom and the ridge and the copper wire, and about how many things had needed to be true simultaneously for any of this to have worked. A girl who chose not to run, a father who chose not to fence it out, an old man who chose to say yes to something he didn't fully understand because 60 years of life had taught him that refusing to be surprised was just another way of dying early. She thought about the word *Papa drawn in a smaller, less practiced hand than Derek's, on the other side of the kind of distance that didn't have a number she could use, and she thought about 2 children who had gotten their father back and wanted to know who to thank. She took the pen and pressed it to the blank page. She started with what she knew, the farm, the equipment shed, a Tuesday in September when the chickens went quiet. She described it in the visual language, her imperfect drawings, the phonetic notation, the accumulated gestures and symbols that she and Derek had built from nothing in 6 weeks. She drew herself with the lantern. She drew him in the corner. She drew the expression she'd seen on his face, the one she still didn't have a word for but knew how to draw now, because she'd spent months thinking about it. She wrote, "My name is Marin. I live on a farm. I found your father on a Tuesday." She wrote, "He was scared and I was curious, and we made something in between." She wrote, "I would like to know your names." She wrote, "I am keeping the antenna on." She looked at what she had and thought it was a start. The language would grow. The vocabulary would build. She had done this once and she could do it again, with patience and time and the notebook system, and the array on the ridge that Hallstrom would probably leave her in his will because he said things like that now, half joking, though with Hallstrom the half joking was always the more true half. She closed the notebook. She looked at the sky. The spring morning was all the way up now, light filling every corner of it, and the farm below the ridge was waking up in its ordinary way, the animals beginning their ordinary sounds, the fields catching the low sun and holding it. From here the farm looked small. From here she could see how it sat in the larger landscape, which sat in the larger landscape of county and state and country and continent and ocean and planet. And she was 10 years old, and she understood that the planet sat in something even larger than that, something that didn't have edges she could see, something that went on past every horizon in every direction. Something that had, it turned out, been listening. She started to write.